I knew the HOA was bad news the second I moved into the neighborhood, but I never thought they'd go as far as arson. Yeah, you heard me, arson. They burned down my cabin. My name's Owen Baxter, and this is the story of how I turned the tables on the most corrupt HOA board you've ever heard of. It all started when I inherited my grandfather's old log cabin on the edge of the neighborhood. It wasn't within the HOA's jurisdiction, but that didn't stop Harriet Whitmore, the nightmare of a president, from trying to control it. She was the queen of nitpicking, the kind of person who'd fine you for leaving your trash can out 5 minutes too long. The first time I met Harriet, she marched up to my front door, clipboard in hand, and said, "Owen, your cabin is an eyesore. It doesn't fit the aesthetic standards of this community." I leaned against the doorframe. "It's not in your community, Harriet." She pursed her lips like she'd just sucked on a lemon. "It's close enough that it affects our property values. We need you to either renovate it or tear it down." I laughed. "Not happening." That's when the harassment started. First, it was minor things, letters in my mailbox demanding I comply with HOA standards, even though I wasn't under their authority. Then they escalated. Someone slashed my truck tires. My mail mysteriously stopped arriving. A neighbor, one of Harriet's loyal lapdogs, stood outside my place every morning, taking pictures as if he was gathering evidence. One day, I came home to find a bright orange notice nailed to a tree on my property. It read, "Notice of demolition. This structure has been deemed unsafe and will be removed per HOA regulations." I ripped it down and stormed to Harriet's house. She answered the door with a smug look. "This is illegal," I said, holding up the notice. She gave a fake, sweet smile. "Oh, I'm afraid you're mistaken. We have the right to enforce community standards." "You don't have any right over my land," I snapped. "Try anything and I'll take legal action." Harriet just tilted her head. "We'll see." A week later, my worst fear came true. I woke up to the sound of sirens. By the time I got to the scene, my cabin was engulfed in flames, an inferno swallowing decades of my family's history. I stood there, helpless, as firefighters battled the blaze. One of them approached me. "We found something suspicious," he said, pointing to charred remains near the foundation. "This wasn't an accident. Looks like an accelerant was used." I gritted my teeth. I knew exactly who was behind this. The next morning, the HOA sent me a letter. "Since the unsafe structure has now been removed, we trust you will maintain the property in accordance with HOA guidelines." That was it. They thought they'd won. They had no idea what I had planned for them. I wasn't the kind of man to let things slide, especially not when someone torched my family's home and expected to get away with it. The moment I saw the smug satisfaction on Harriet Whitmore's face as she watched my cabin burn from her pristine front porch, I knew she thought she'd won. What she didn't realize was that she just made the biggest mistake of her life. I spent the next few days doing exactly what Harriet expected, looking defeated, letting her think I was licking my wounds, but behind the scenes I was working hard. The first thing I did was hire a private investigator. I wasn't about to rely on the local police, not when the HOA had their claws in everything around here. The investigator, a grizzled old Marine named Frank Nolan, had seen his fair share of corruption. When I told him what happened, he didn't even blink. "This isn't some kids playing with matches," Frank said. "This was deliberate, and if it was the HOA, I guarantee they left a trail." While Frank got to work, I started digging into the HOA itself. I knew Harriet and her board were power-hungry, but I needed hard proof of just how deep their corruption ran. It didn't take long to find plenty. Public records showed that the HOA's finances were a mess. Money was disappearing every year, dues were mysteriously increasing, and no one in the neighborhood seemed to know where it was going. Even better, I found out the HOA wasn't just a neighborhood association, it was technically a corporation, meaning it could be bought. And I had just the plan to do it. Over the next few weeks, I quietly started purchasing HOA shares from disgruntled homeowners. Turns out, I wasn't the only one sick of Harriet's reign of terror. Plenty of residents were fed up with the insane fines, the ridiculous rules, and the blatant favoritism Harriet showed to her inner circle. They were more than happy to sell their shares to me. While I worked on my takeover, Frank delivered his report. What he found was damning. Security camera footage from a house near my cabin showed a black SUV pulling up the night before the fire. Two men got out, carrying what looked like gas cans. They were careful, avoiding direct angles to the cameras, but Frank had sources. He managed to track down the vehicle's registration. It belonged to one of the HOA board members. That was enough to get the fire department to reclassify the incident as arson and open a formal investigation. Now, I had leverage. Armed with evidence, I made my move. I called for an emergency HOA meeting. Harriet, of course, tried to shut it down, but by this point I had acquired over 50% of the voting power. Legally, she couldn't stop me. The night of the meeting, the entire neighborhood showed up. People were tired of Harriet's antics, but they didn't know just how bad things were yet. I walked up to the front, documents in hand, and addressed the crowd. I laid out everything. The financial corruption, the illegal fines, the missing money. I even had copies of emails showing that Harriet and her cronies had been using HOA funds for personal vacations. The room erupted in outrage. And then, I played the footage of the SUV at my cabin the night before the fire. The silence that followed was deafening. Harriet's face went pale. Before she could start making excuses, I dropped the final bombshell. I was now the majority owner of the HOA. Effective immediately, the entire board was fired. Harriet tried to argue, claiming she had rights, but I had legal documents proving otherwise. Then, the police officers I'd quietly invited entered the room. They had a warrant for Harriet and her board members. The moment the cuffs snapped around her wrists was the most satisfying thing I'd ever seen. As she was led away, she shouted about how she'd get revenge, how the neighborhood would fall apart without her. No one believed her. In fact, as soon as she was gone, the entire room burst into applause. With Harriet and her cronies out of the picture, I took control of the HOA and did what should have been done years ago. I dissolved it entirely. No more ridiculous rules, no more fabricated fines, no more power-hungry tyrants trying to control people's lives. And as for my cabin, the insurance payout was more than enough to rebuild it, bigger and better than before. Harriet thought she could destroy me. Instead, I destroyed everything she built. With Harriet and her entire corrupt board out of the picture, the neighborhood took a collective breath of relief. But I wasn't done yet. Just because the tyrants were gone didn't mean the mess they left behind had magically disappeared. The HOA's financials were in shambles. The homeowners were still dealing with years of unfair fines, and there was a lingering fear that another power-hungry dictator might step in to fill the void. I wasn't about to let that happen. The first thing I did was hire a forensic accountant to go through the HOA's books. What she found was even worse than I expected. There were fraudulent maintenance fees, fake invoices for repairs that never happened, and thousands of dollars siphoned into personal bank accounts. Harriet and her board had been robbing the neighborhood blind for years. The best part, all those shady transactions were documented under Harriet's name and those of her board members. They hadn't even tried to cover their tracks properly. It was almost insulting how sloppy they were. With hard evidence in hand, I worked with the local DA to push for criminal charges. Harriet and her cronies were already facing arson charges, but now they had embezzlement and fraud stacked on top of that. The moment news broke that they could be facing serious prison time, the neighborhood erupted in celebration. But I wasn't just here for revenge. I wanted to make sure no one could ever do this again. I set up an emergency meeting for the entire neighborhood. People packed into the community center, eager to hear what came next. I explained in clear terms what Harriet and her board had done, stealing from them, manipulating the rules, and abusing their power for years. People were furious, but they were also ready for change. I laid out my plan. The HOA wasn't just going to be restructured, it was going to be abolished completely. No more ridiculous fines, no more overreaching authority, no more power plays. The land and community would be governed by basic city ordinances, like any normal neighborhood. A vote was held, and the results were overwhelming. The HOA was officially dissolved, but there was still the issue of all the money Harriet had stolen. I wasn't about to let her crimes go unanswered. Through legal channels, I worked with the DA to freeze all assets tied to the HOA's fraudulent accounts. That money stolen from hardworking homeowners was going to be returned. It took some legal maneuvering, but within a few months, we secured restitution payments for every homeowner who had been unfairly fined. Harriet's ill-gotten gains were stripped away, and people finally got the justice they deserved. With the HOA gone, something incredible happened. The neighborhood became a community again. People started helping each other instead of spying on their own neighbors for violations. The constant fear of fines and inspections disappeared, and homeowners finally felt like they had control over their own properties. As for me, I focused on rebuilding my grandfather's cabin. I spared no expense, making sure it was stronger and more fire-resistant than before. But more than that, I made sure it would stand as a reminder that no one, not even a corrupt HOA, could take away what was rightfully mine. Harriet and her board. They ended up exactly where they belonged, behind bars. Their downfall became legendary in the area, a cautionary tale for any HOA that thought they could get away with abusing their power. And as I sat on the porch of my newly rebuilt cabin, overlooking the land my family had owned for generations, I knew one thing for certain: this was my home, and no one would ever take it from me again. With the HOA officially dismantled and Harriet's empire reduced to rubble, I expected things to settle down. But what I didn't expect was just how deep their corruption had run, or how many people had been waiting for someone to finally take a stand. In the weeks after the vote, neighbors I had barely spoken to started approaching me. Some just wanted to thank me, relieved to finally be free from the iron grip of the HOA. Others had stories of their own tales of fines that made no sense, threats issued over trivial matters, and even outright blackmail Harriet and her cronies had used to keep people in line. One story stood out more than the rest. An elderly couple, the Whitmans, had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. They had been among the first homeowners, long before the HOA had sunk its claws into the place. When Harriet took over, she had made their lives miserable. The HOA had hit them with endless fines, claiming their house's exterior appearance didn't meet the community standards. But the real reason: Harriet wanted their property. The Whitmans owned a large corner lot, valuable land that Harriet had plans for. She had tried to pressure them into selling cheap, using fines and harassment to force them out. Hearing that made my blood boil. Harriet had always been petty and power-hungry, but outright trying to steal someone's home, that was a new level of despicable. I decided to do something about it. With the HOA gone, the Whitmans' unpaid fines were legally unenforceable. I worked with a local lawyer to get the bogus penalties wiped from their record, and for the first time in years, they could finally live in peace. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to make sure Harriet never had the chance to pull something like this again, even after she got out of prison. That's when I started looking into the deeds of the properties Harriet had been involved with. The HOA had controlled a separate fund meant for community improvements, which unsurprisingly Harriet had used as her personal piggy bank. But buried in those documents, I found something interesting. Harriet had been scheming to buy up multiple properties in the neighborhood under a shell company she controlled. Her plan had been simple: force certain homeowners out, buy their houses for pennies on the dollar, then resell them at a massive profit once she'd cleaned up the neighborhood. It was fraud, plain and simple. I handed everything over to the DA, who was more than happy to tack additional charges onto Harriet's growing list of legal troubles. When word got out, it sent shockwaves through the community. People who had once feared Harriet now openly celebrated her downfall. But even with Harriet gone, there were still remnants of her influence hanging over the neighborhood. Some of her former allies, the ones who had benefited from her crooked rule, weren't too happy about losing their cushy positions. They tried to stir up trouble, claiming that without the HOA, the neighborhood would fall into chaos. I wasn't about to let them rewrite history. I organized a community meeting, this time not in the sterile confines of the HOA office, but in the local park, the same place Harriet had once banned children from playing because she thought it made the area too noisy. At the gathering, I laid out a simple plan. The neighborhood didn't need an HOA to function. Basic city laws covered safety and property maintenance just fine. Instead of a governing body dictating what people could and couldn't do, we would rely on voluntary cooperation. If someone needed help with their yard, neighbors could pitch in. If there was an issue with a property, we could handle it as a community instead of slapping people with arbitrary fines. Not everyone was convinced at first, but over time, the results spoke for themselves. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, people actually started taking better care of their homes not because they were afraid of fines, but because they wanted to. With the money that once went into HOA fees, people invested in their properties, businesses flourished, and the sense of paranoia that had once dominated the neighborhood slowly disappeared. As for me, I finally got to focus on rebuilding my grandfather's cabin. It wasn't just about restoring what had been lost, it was about making it better, stronger. A permanent reminder that no matter how much power someone thought they had, they could never take away what truly mattered. On the day I finished construction, I invited the entire neighborhood over for a barbecue. It was a celebration not just for me, but for everyone who had suffered under Harriet's rule. The Whitmans were there, smiling for the first time in years. Families who had once been afraid to let their kids play outside now watched as they ran freely across the yard. As the sun set, I stood on the porch of my new cabin, looking out at the people who had become more than just neighbors, they were friends. Harriet had tried to ruin this place, but in the end, all she had done was bring us together. And that was something no corrupt HOA could ever take away. With the HOA gone and Harriet rotting in a jail cell, I expected life to finally calm down. But what I didn't expect was just how deep the rot of her control had spread. Removing her was like ripping out a weed, but the roots were still tangled in the neighborhood. Some of her old allies weren't ready to let things go. I started noticing small things at first. My tools went missing from my shed. A few boards from my newly rebuilt cabin were mysteriously pried loose overnight. My truck's gas tank had sugar dumped in it, forcing me to get it towed. None of it was major, but it was enough to tell me someone was still holding a grudge. It wasn't hard to figure out who. Harriet's inner circle, the ones who had benefited from her rule, had lost everything when I took over the HOA. They weren't thrilled about being regular homeowners again, and some of them still wanted revenge. I wasn't about to let them get away with it. Instead of reacting, I did what I always did. I gathered proof. I installed security cameras around my property, hidden in places no one would think to check. I made sure every inch of my land was covered. I didn't have to wait long. A few nights later, the cameras caught exactly what I needed. Two of Harriet's closest allies' former board members sneaking onto my property. They were carrying crowbars, prying at my window frames, and trying to cause as much damage as they could. One of them even spray-painted "traitor" on the side of my cabin. They were so confident they wouldn't get caught that they didn't even bother wearing masks. The next morning, I walked right up to both of their houses and handed them printed stills from the footage. I didn't say a word, just waited. One of them turned pale, hands shaking as he realized what I had. The other one tried to bluster, saying I couldn't prove anything. I just tilted my head, watching as his confidence cracked. By the end of the day, both of them had moved. Their houses went up for sale almost immediately, and within weeks they were gone. I never had to call the police. They knew what I had on them, and they knew I wasn't bluffing, but that was just the beginning. With the HOA dismantled, the neighborhood was thriving, but there was still unfinished business. Harriet's shameless greed had left financial wreckage in its wake. Some people were still dealing with fraudulent liens she'd placed on their homes, and others had been forced into bad loans because of the fines she'd slapped on them. I spent the next few months working with a legal team to undo the damage. Every fake lien, every bogus debt Harriet had manufactured, I made sure it was wiped clean. Homeowners who had been struggling for years finally got relief. It wasn't easy, and it took a lot of legal maneuvering, but in the end, Harriet's entire paper empire crumbled. But the biggest surprise came when I got a call from a local reporter. Harriet's downfall had sparked interest outside the neighborhood. It turned out she had a history of pulling similar schemes in other communities before she came here. Once word got out about what she had done, other neighborhoods started coming forward with their own horror stories. I sat down for an interview, laying everything out. The corruption, the fraud, the arson, all of it. I didn't hold back. The reporter ran the story, and within days it went viral. Harriet became a cautionary tale, her name synonymous with HOA corruption. And that's when I got the final piece of justice I'd been waiting for. A judge ruled that Harriet's crimes weren't just fraud and arson, they were part of an organized effort to manipulate housing markets for personal gain. That meant additional charges, harsher penalties, and worst of all, for her massive restitution payments. She wasn't just going to prison, she was going to be bankrupt for life. With Harriet completely ruined and her former allies either gone or too scared to try anything, the neighborhood finally felt free. The fear that had hung over everyone for years was gone. People took back their homes, their lives, and their sense of community. And as for me, I finally got to enjoy my cabin in peace. Sitting on my porch, watching the sun set over the land my grandfather had built, I knew one thing for sure: no one would ever try to take it from me again. With Harriet's downfall complete and her name forever tied to corruption, the neighborhood finally felt like it could breathe again. The endless fines, the threats, the paranoia, it was all gone. People had their homes back, and they were no longer afraid of stepping one toe out of line. But just because Harriet was out of the picture didn't mean everything was perfect. There were still lingering scars, both financial and emotional, left in the wake of her destruction. Some homeowners were still struggling to recover from the bogus penalties she had imposed. Others were wary of any form of neighborhood leadership, afraid that someone else might try to seize the power vacuum she had left behind. I wasn't about to let that happen. The first order of business was making sure Harriet's influence was wiped clean from every corner of the neighborhood. I met with the city council, providing them with all the financial records. I had uncovered proof of the fabricated maintenance fees, the fraudulent liens, and the illegal land acquisitions she had attempted. With those documents in hand, the city agreed to officially void all outstanding HOA-related debts. That meant that anyone who had been forced to pay absurd fines or had their credit damaged by her schemes was finally free. Any homeowner who had been placed under financial strain because of those penalties was now clear of them. The relief was immediate. People who had been struggling for years to keep up with the HOA's ever-increasing demands could finally move forward without fear of financial ruin. The neighborhood's mood shifted, but there was still one final piece of unfinished business. Even with the HOA gone, Harriet's grip on the neighborhood had left a lasting imprint. Some of her most loyal supporters, even though they had lost their power, still lived in the community. They weren't in charge anymore, but they weren't happy about it either. I had already dealt with the worst of them, the ones who had vandalized my property and tried to intimidate me. But there were still a handful who remained, bitter and resentful, clinging onto the last shreds of control they thought they had. They tried to stir up trouble in small ways, spreading rumors, whispering about how the neighborhood was going to fall apart without the HOA. Some of them even tried to form an unofficial community council, claiming that they would act as a guiding force to keep things in order. I wasn't about to let that happen. I attended their first meeting, showing up uninvited. The moment I stepped into the room, their little group fell silent. They knew exactly who I was and what I had done. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I laid out the facts. The HOA was gone. The era of forced compliance, of arbitrary rules and fines, was over. If they wanted to form a neighborhood watch to help keep things safe, that was one thing. But if they were planning on trying to rebuild the HOA under a different name, I would be watching. And I would make sure they never got the chance. No one argued. They knew they had lost. One by one, the last remnants of Harriet's old regime faded away. Some of them moved out entirely, unwilling to live in a place where they no longer held power. Others simply fell silent, blending into the background as regular homeowners. Either way, their influence was gone. With the last of Harriet's loyalists dealt with, the neighborhood was finally free. People started talking to each other again, not as rivals forced into compliance, but as actual neighbors. Without the constant threat of fines or penalties, homeowners took care of their properties because they wanted to, not because they were being forced to. The paranoia that had once plagued the community was gone. The neighborhood flourished in ways it never had before. As for me, I finally got to enjoy my life without looking over my shoulder. My cabin, now fully rebuilt, stood stronger than ever. It wasn't just a home, it was proof that no amount of corruption or intimidation could take away what was rightfully mine. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, a few of my neighbors stopped by. They brought food, drinks, and good company. It wasn't a planned gathering, just people coming together because they wanted to. As we sat around the fire, talking and laughing, I realized something. Harriet had spent years trying to turn this neighborhood into her personal empire. She had ruled through fear, manipulation, and greed. But in the end, it had all crumbled, and the neighborhood was better for it. No more HOA, no more power plays. Just people living their lives, free from the control of a corrupt tyrant. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood finally felt like home.